Okay, so we are going to be doing our very first yeast bread today. Okay, so somebody tell me what yeast is. Anybody know what yeast is? Is it a chemical leavening agent?
Yes.
It is a leavening agent, but it's not a chemical leavening agent. That was a trick question. Okay, so yeast is actually a living organism. It is alive, okay? When you buy it at the grocery store, you can buy it in like a tub like this or in just like a little packet. It's dried. So it's not like, it's just sleeping, okay? We can say it's just sleeping. The way you wake up your yeast is it needs warm liquid and it needs something to eat. Yeast likes sugars and carbohydrates, okay? So in order to make our yeast alive and happy, we're going to use warm water and we're going to add a little bit of sugar to that. Give it some food, okay? So first things first, I'm going to warm up some water, okay? I have 1.5 cups of water and I'm going to warm that up. Now, the tricky bit, so those of you who said you needed a thermometer, I put them in bags and they were outside in front of the school. Hopefully you got one. These come in handy because I want the water or the liquid, whatever liquid I'm using for my yeast, to proof my yeast, I want it to be about 110 to 115 degrees, okay? If the water or liquid is too hot for the yeast, it will kill the yeast and your bread will not work. There will be no rising at all. It will not rise, okay? So if it's too hot, it'll kill the yeast. If it's too cold, it'll still work. It'll just be really slow and it'll take a lot longer, okay? So, so you want to make sure that it is right around 110 to 115. Now, if you don't have a thermometer, you can feel the water with your hands, okay? So what temperature is our body? When you take your temperature, what are you usually? Good, yes. Yeah, and Anton put 97.8. Yeah, somewhere around there, okay? So if I want this water to be 110 degrees, that's going to feel slightly warm to me, right? It's going to feel like a nice warm bath. This feels a little hot to me, but we'll see. I'm going to see what it is. I want it 110 to 115. Okay, that's like my happy place for my yeast. Okay, that is actually really close to 115. Right about 115. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pour. Actually, I'll just leave it in here because you guys will be able to see it a little bit better. I'm going to add my yeast. Actually, I'm going to add sugar first. So how much sugar do I have? I have 1 tablespoon sugar. And then I'm going to add my yeast. And I'm just going to give that a little stir. So we're hydrating that yeast in the warm water. It has that sugar to eat. So it should start to get happy and start to bubble, okay? So I'm just going to set this off to the side for now while I get the other ingredients ready, and then we'll keep an eye on it. So take a look and see. This is what it looks like now. It just looks like murky water, okay? Okay, so I'm doing this by hand for you guys instead of using my mixer because I know some of you don't have a stand mixer. It's actually better for the dough to knead it by hand because it doesn't rip it as much as your stand mixer does, even though the stand mixer makes it so much easier. Last night I actually made a batch of dough so that I could have some ready, so while I'm waiting for this batch to rise, I'll be able to move on and show you the rest of the pretzels. But we're going to do this one by hand. Actually, I'm going to take my ring off now. Okay, so I'm going to have, I have 4.5 cups of flour, and like I said, I'm just using all-purpose flour, and I've measured the flour the way I always do by gently spooning it into the measuring cup and leveling it off. Okay, I need 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. Now, I'm just going to add that into the flour. The recipe that I'm using, that wasn't quite full, actually came from Alton Brown, and his recipe said to add the salt in with the sugar and the yeast. Now, I know he's really good at what he does, but I changed the recipe and I added the salt to my flour because salt affects yeast in a bad way. Salt will slow down the production, the yeast, and it could, if you put too much salt on your yeast, it could kill your yeast. So instead of putting the salt in with the sugar and yeast, I decided to put it in with my flour. I'm going to give it a quick whisk to make sure it gets whisked in. And then I'm going to show you guys this. Hopefully you can see the yeast. Can you guys tell the difference now? Now there is like about a half of a centimeter of bubbles on top. Foamy, frothy bubbles. And that is showing me that the yeast is alive, because what it's doing is it's eating that sugar, and as it eats the sugar, it releases a byproduct of carbon dioxide, and those are those little bubbles, and that is what's going to give our bread its lift and its rise. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, good. So let me make sure that I have all the ingredients together. I've got the water, I've got the sugar, I've got the salt, I've got the yeast, I've got my flour. The last thing I need is 4 tablespoons of melted butter. So it's half of a stick of butter, because 1 full stick of butter has 8 tablespoons, right? So I'm just going to quickly melt this in my microwave. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to preheat my oven, and I want my oven to be preheated to 450 degrees. And on the stove top, I have 10 cups of just tap water, and I have 2/3 of cups of baking soda that I've added to that water. I'm going to turn up the heat on that to get that boiling, because just like bagels, I don't know if you guys have ever made bagels or seen people make bagels, they actually parboil them prior to baking them. And what it does is it kind of gives it a quick puff, so it helps the insides be really soft like a bagel, but the outside has this wonderful chew, and the baking soda actually helps the browning, and so it makes it look really pretty and beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to get that boiling as well, so that's ready for our pretzels when we're ready. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this a little bit better now. Can you see that layer right there? This right here is the happy bubbles. That's showing me that my yeast is alive and it's in a good condition right now, okay? And I've got my melted butter. So I'm going to add my yeast mixture to my flour. Make sure you get it all. And I'm going to take a wooden spoon, and I'm going to start to stir this gently. Okay. Let me see if I can show you. Can you guys see that? So I'm just going to slowly keep mixing this. I'm going to drizzle in the butter a little bit. And then mix that all up really good. It's not going to come together 100%. It's going to be really crumbly, and it's going to start to be kind of difficult to stir. This is where KitchenAids come in handy, because they're a lot stronger than we are, right? But that's okay. We can do this by hand. Okay, so it's really it looks like it's really ripped a lot. I am going to sprinkle just a tiny bit of flour on my work surface, I've thoroughly cleaned my countertop before I started this morning, and I'm gonna dump out all of this good stuff that's in my bowl. Is this at a good angle for you guys? Can you guys see that okay? Okay. So, there are some really wet spots of this dough and there's some really dry spots because it hasn't been combined, right? So we are going to start the kneading process. Now, why do we knead our dough? What am I doing? Does anybody know?
Folding it or?
Yeah, I'm folding it on itself and kind of pushing it, and I'm stretching it out. What does this do? What is the purpose of kneading? Do you remember what we were talking about in the beginning about what?
Air bubbles?
What is it, Jake?
Doesn't it take away the air bubbles?
So punching it down does, and I'm going to do that in just a second with my dough that I made yesterday. But what I'm doing, why am I kneading? I'm kneading because you know those proteins we were talking about, the gluten? I'm kneading because I'm trying to work the gluten and break up the bonds so that they kind of stretch out and form this big network, okay? And then what's going to happen is the gluten comes together and it turns into a really strong network once it's kneaded properly so that it can hold in all of those carbon dioxide bubbles that the yeast is producing, and that is going to make your bread rise. Okay? So technically you would want to knead this. Everyone has their own technique of kneading, but you want to knead it for about 5 to 10 minutes, and you will notice it gets smoother and softer and a little bit more stretchy. So one thing you can do to check to see if your dough has been kneaded enough, this is a good workout by the way, I'm a little bit winded, just letting you know. Okay, so you can take a little bit of your dough and you can kind of flatten it out a little bit and then stretch it. And this is called the window pane test. So you don't want it to rip. You want to be able to almost see through it. Obviously my gluten hasn't been developed enough, so I'm going to keep kneading it a little bit longer. Even if you have a KitchenAid, I highly suggest you try to do this by hand. It is extremely therapeutic. You can get some music going, have a little dance party, a kneading dance party in your kitchen, okay? But you need to get to know the feel of dough, okay? And you will learn without having to do the window pane test when your dough is ready, just by feeling it and looking at it. So be creative. You guys can make whatever kind of pretzels you want with this. Okay, so I've been kneading it for quite some time. So I'm gonna take a little bit and we'll see. Hopefully it's a little bit better. See how I can stretch it more without it ripping? So that's better. I've been working the gluten a lot. So I could continue probably for another minute or so, but I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna show you guys how to form it into a nice ball. So I'm gonna form this into a nice ball. This is a good technique to use if you're gonna be making rolls too. So I'm gonna push kind of down with the palm of my hand against the counter and pull back with this part of my hand and just keep doing that. I'm using the counter actually to kind of hold it or to kind of stick it so that it creates a nice ball, okay? So underneath there should be like a little crease, but the top should be nice and smooth. A bit of vegetable oil, olive oil, whatever you've got. Just need a little bit. And then I'm gonna take a paper towel and just kind of spread it around. Now, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because this is the bowl that I'm gonna allow my bread to rest and rise in. And the grease makes it nice and slippery so that while this is trying to rise, it doesn't get stuck on the side of the bowl and prevent it from rising. So I'm gonna turn this ball around in that grease, coating the whole ball with grease. And then I'm gonna put a tea towel over it and just let it sit until it's doubled in size. It'll probably take maybe about an hour. Now, if you don't want to make your pretzels that day, or your whatever it is your yeast spreads that day, you can cover it in plastic wrap and refrigerate it. That is called retarding your dough. And what that means is you're slowing down the yeast production of carbon dioxide, because what happens when it gets cold, or if I use too cold of water, right, it goes a lot slower, and so it doesn't produce all of those carbon dioxide bubbles as quickly. So this was in my refrigerator. I made this last night. I stuck it in this bowl and it still rose, but instead of it rising this much in an hour, it rose that much all night. I took it out of the fridge about 2 hours ago so that it could come to room temperature. It's still actually quite cold, but I think that will actually make it a little bit easier for me to work with if it's cold. So I'm gonna I have this little handy dandy rubber scraper. They're like $1 and they're totally awesome if you make a lot of yeasted doughs. They're really good to scrape it out of the counter or out of your bowl. So I'm just gonna scrape this out onto my work surface. Get these out of the way. And get my baking sheets ready. Now, Jake, you were the one who was talking about punching out the bubbles, right? Deflating the bubbles?
Yes, I was.
So this is the point where you're doing that. Just so you know, what's awesome about this, because I let it slow rise in the refrigerator, it has a slight sour smell to it, like a sourdough, because the fermentation process was longer, and the longer your bread ferments, the more flavorful it'll become. So I'm just going to gently punch out these with my fingers. Okay, some people like to get a little bit more tough on their bread, but I'm just going to do that gently. Then I like to use one of these. This is a table scraper, but it's really good for dough too. I need to cut this into 8 separate pieces. Equal. I want them as equal in size as I possibly can. It doesn't have to be perfect though. It's not going to be the end of the world if it's not perfect. So this one recipe is going to make 8 pretty good sized pretzels. Okay, so I've got 8 little pieces of pizza. I'm just going to take one for now. I don't want to overwork my dough at this time. If I overwork my dough, that gluten might start getting a little tighter and it'll be really hard to stretch these out, okay? So gently, I'm just going to roll these out. Now you'll notice I did not add any more flour to my work surface. And that's because if I add more flour to my work surface at this point, it'll be really hard to roll this out because it'll just slip and slide along the flour. Okay, so you don't want to add more flour unless it's crazy sticky, which means that maybe there was some mistake in your mixing in the beginning. Then you might need to add a little bit more flour. If you find it's a little difficult to roll out, like all of a sudden it stops rolling out, stop, put it aside, let it rest while you work on the other ones. If you just give it like 5 minutes to relax, let that gluten kind of relax, then it'll be easier to roll out again. Okay? See if my water's boiling. Not yet. Now, we're going to get to the fun part pretty soon. I'll just do 4 of these for now, and then I'll move on so you guys can see. You want them pretty equal in size, so go back to your childhood when you used to make snakes out of your Play-Doh. You want the thickness to be the same throughout. Okay, so here's the fun part, okay? Have you ever sat there and watched the people at Wetzel's Pretzels twist their pretzels? It's super cool to watch. So it's really a flick of the wrist. One hand goes this way, one hand goes that way. Ready? Let's see if I can do it. Okay, so that took me, I had to kind of fix it a little bit, but you have a little pretzel, okay? So I have my baking sheet. I'm going to line my baking sheet with some parchment paper. And I'm going to spray it with a little oil. You could just rub, regular vegetable oil on it if you wanted. Okay, that is almost boiling. So I'm going to twist and shape a couple more of these pretzels. So I have my 4 pretzels. Before I boil those, I'm going to do get an egg wash ready. Okay, so I'm only going to use the yolk for this egg wash. The egg wash also makes the pretzels shinier. It makes whatever topping you're using stick to it, and it helps the browning. So I only need the yolk. So I am going to crack my egg and get the yolk out. So it's easier than you think. You can just pour it in your hand if you want, but I like to use the shells. So I cracked it on the flat surface, and I'm going to go back and forth until I have just the yolk left over in the shell, or as little white as possible. Okay, that egg white you could totally save and use in an omelet or something, but I'm just going to dump it for now because I don't have a lot of time. Okay, so for the egg wash, I need the yolk, and I need a tablespoon of water, and I'm just going to beat that up with a fork all together. Okay, and I've got my egg wash all ready. I have a little pastry brush. If you don't have a little pastry brush, you could just kind of like spoon it on gently with a fork. You just want a thin layer on your pretzels right before you put them in. I'm going to be using this flat spatula because this is the best thing that I have. I don't have like a little spider, but I'm going to turn this down a little bit because it's kind of hot. I'm going to gently place a pretzel on my spatula, and I'm going to lower it into the water, and I'm going to let it boil for 30 seconds. So that's been 30 seconds. So now I am just going to pull them out and put them back onto my baking sheet. They're kind of slimy. Okay, now I am going to just brush these with my egg mixture. So I'm just going to put some salt on these ones. Oh no, I just spilled my egg mixture. I don't have pretzel salt. I have sea salt, and I have kosher salt. So really whatever salt you have will work. Now I'm going to stick these in the oven. And let's see, make sure I'm doing it for the right time. Bake until dark golden brown in color, 12 to 14 minutes.